Sakim Dagama, who was the trade representative, who was then replaced with Marumo Nkomo, also from the Trade Department earlier this year. What we wrote about was a somewhat remarkable story. And I tell this here just to add something beyond, I think, the statistics and the facts and the straightforward historical timeline of this matter. Marumo Nkomo is someone I've known for many years. He is one of the rare, brilliant, bright, dedicated, smart, and absolutely professional bureaucrats who works in South Africa for his government out of a patriotic duty. He continued this patriotic duty when he moved to Geneva. His father, however, stayed behind in South Africa. His father, Abe Nkomo, was a sort of giant in South African public life, a member of parliament, anti-apartheid organizer, community physician, diplomat, but also more crucially, at a time when it mattered in South Africa in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the chair of something called the Portfolio Committee on Health in the South African Parliament. So when a group of very disadvantaged HIV positive activists in South Africa in the late 90s started protesting the price of AIDS medicines, they found that there was only one voice in the South African government and parliament who was willing to listen to them, support them, and understood the kind of emergency that they were in. That was Abe Nkomo. He helped put through legislative changes in the late 90s that really allowed South Africa to make its own decisions on buying generic AIDS drugs. He continued to be a champion for people with HIV and was fondly remembered as so when he died this year on the 10th of July of COVID. Now, Dr. Nkomo, who was 80, got his first dose of a Pfizer vaccine on the 9th of June. He contracted COVID on the 26th of June, and he died before he could get his second dose. His son, Marumo Nkomo, the South African trade representative in Geneva, in the weeks leading up to his death, was in frenzied negotiations with all of the objecting countries to see what kind of compromise deal could be reached. And often, many of these meetings were humiliating. This didn't come to me directly from the South African negotiating team, but from others who were present and involved. There were meetings that the South Africans held with countries in the West, unnamed countries in the West, where they were openly mocked, they were laughed at. There were ambassadors who would take other calls while the South Africans were pitching them options as to how they could push a waiver proposal through. In the days leading up to his father's death, Marumo took a leave of absence, flew back to South Africa in time he hoped to see his father. He landed, as it turned out, 10 minutes after his father died. A few days later, he was back in South Africa with his boss, Kolelwa Peter Blumbi, who herself had suffered numerous losses in South Africa at that time. The irony of all of this is that at the age of 80, had Dr. Nkomo lived in the United States or the United Kingdom, he'd have been vaccinated by January. Had he lived in India, not the kind of place that you typically think of as being first in line to receive a vaccine, he would have been vaccinated by March, as my parents who are in that age group were. But because he lived in South Africa, despite being a giant in public health, somebody who'd worked all his life to improve the public health of South Africans, often at a cost to his own political career, he received his vaccine in the middle of June, too late to save his life. There's something about the story that really moved me very, very much, despite having lived through India in April and May, when we recorded in this country up to 5,000 deaths a day. A period of time which I can only describe as unbearable, and perhaps the most excruciating 3 months I've ever lived through in my life, which I hope never ever to have to face again. I think there is a kind of irony here that we're supposedly at the end of this pandemic in the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe and Switzerland, whereas 10,000 people are dying a day. Sure, it's not 15,000 people who are dying a day as it was in May, but it's 10,000 people a day. And somehow that seems to register as normalcy or as an improvement. I don't know how, but it does. Since vaccines were introduced in January of 2020, we have to think of every person who's died as being a death that could have been prevented. Since March of 2021, I should note that the tenor of the pandemic has changed. The pandemic itself has mutated. What was earlier a pandemic that primarily caused deaths in rich countries then became a pandemic that primarily caused deaths in developing countries. When you look at the graph of the income levels of countries which are recording the most deaths in the pandemic, a minority is now coming from rich countries. The majority of deaths are coming from middle income and low income countries. That trend looks set to continue because of failing vaccination rates, because of the fact that across the continent of Africa, less than 3% of people are vaccinated. Even in India, where we've not only banned exports of vaccines that were contracted to other poor countries, but are scrambling at the same time to supply enough vaccines to vaccinate our incredibly large population. We have rates of vaccination that are not impressive, in between 30 and 40% of all adults being fully vaccinated. Of course, living in the United States, you'll be well aware of the flip-flops in policy. 2 months ago, you might have well thought that the pandemic was behind you, that you were done with this, masks were off, schools were open, life was normal. And then the reality of the Delta variant hit. And when it did, I think what it underscored in the United States is the awful idea that the self-containment strategy of rich countries vaccinating as many people as they can within their borders is simply not enough. Yes, vaccinated people still are protected to a really great and wonderful extent, which means that even if you were to contract COVID and be one of those breakthrough cases, you are still largely protected from hospitalization and death. This is not going to be as severe as it would have been had you not been vaccinated. It is a very different kind of pandemic. But now it is a situation of uncertainty, an uncertainty that has personal costs in terms of anxiety and rollercoasting emotions, but also professional and economic costs to the country as a whole, in terms of economic recovery, in terms of economic growth, in terms of things like whether companies feel confident enough to hire people. And so there is a bizarre way in which countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, instead of looking at the fact that the Delta variant came from my country, from India, at a time when 3% of our population was vaccinated, and that therefore they should pay close attention to any country that has the same low rates of vaccination, is instead choosing to deal with the uncertainty by authorizing booster shots and thereby taking up even more of the world's dwindling supply of effective coronavirus vaccines. And there is an entire continent, the size of which rivals the population of India, which is about 3% vaccinated, and that's the continent of Africa. And the idea that you would let something like that be, allow all the future uncertainty and economic anxiety that may come from, who knows what there is lying there in terms of what kinds of mutations and variants may emerge, to me personally strikes me as ludicrous. I mean, I've always believed that countries like the United States and the UK and Switzerland should be vaccinating the world because it's the right thing to do. It turns out that it's also the right thing to do for themselves. And it's therefore a puzzle as to why all of this is not happening, because the only winners in this battle are companies like Pfizer and Moderna, who are set to post unprecedented profits on, that word unprecedented, that horrible word that's thrown around in the pandemic. The only unprecedented thing that I know is that the Pfizer vaccine will bring in $35 billion in revenue to the company, but that's from one single product. The Pfizer's prior to this, their largest selling product was also a vaccine, the pneumonia vaccine, but that brought in $5 billion. I mean, so this is a 7-fold jump in profits on a single product alone. It's just completely unheard of. There's so much that the US government can do in terms of technology transfer on vaccines like Moderna, but also vaccines that the United States doesn't actually want, like Johnson & Johnson. As far as I can tell, no one in the United States really wants that vaccine, but it's a good vaccine, it works. There are plenty of countries without the same kinds of choices who want that vaccine. India's one, the African continent is another. And the United States could give away that technology because it paid for it, right? But it isn't doing that. Support for the TRIPS waiver was a great step. But in our conversations with the South African team, I think what came across loud and clear is that now the United States can do a few key things. Firstly, of course, support the technology transfer of key vaccines that it's funded and is in control of. Secondly, however, signal clearly at the World Trade Organization that it wants an outcome on the process that it kickstarted in May, without signaling that it wants an outcome that the South Africans and Indians who proposed this would be happy with. There isn't any chance that objecting countries like the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland, who are the three most prominent opponents of the TRIPS waiver proposal, will come around. So there's an incredible role for the US to play, and I really do hope in the next few months the US understands exactly what its responsibility is, understands that we know that we will hold them responsible to execute that responsibility. And I hope we can make sure it happens. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Achal, for joining us. I'm waiting to see if there are questions in the chat. Yeah, I don't see any questions just now. If we get some for you, I will be happy to pass them along to you. Thank you so much for joining us so late in the evening, Achal. I really appreciate it. And I'm always happy for our coalition partners to get to hear from you.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Have a good night, Achal. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Next, we are going to hear from Matthew Rose, the U.S. Policy and Advocacy Director at Health Gap, on the domestic landscape around securing the TRIPS waiver. Go ahead, Matthew.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone who's joining us today. It's a super nerdy topic. Love to talk about it. It huge effects on our lives, and we have gone the roller coaster ride on this. My organization was out there early last November calling for signing onto the waiver, even in defiance of the Trump administration, and we're not doing this. And then the fight to get the Biden administration to do it, including getting over 100 members of Congress to sign on to a letter supporting the waiver, and then cultivating in that amazing moment where Ambassador Tai said that they would be publicly supporting a waiver and that they should be instructing her team in Geneva to be working on the negotiations. And so and a lot of that is from great folks like you folks who are in the field, who help make calls, help talk to legislators, make them know that you're on their side if they're going to do this. All super important for getting us where we're at today. Now, unfortunately, things have moved in a couple directions. One is our favorite friends, Germans, have been holding up the EU on putting. It's weird to call it a counter proposal because it's really just like, hey, can we keep doing the same thing we've always done? But look, we gave it a new name. And we've tried to push back on this from both people in Washington protesting outside of the UN Commission building. We had a giant puppet of Angela Merkel having fights over the vaccine for the fat cat, and it was pretty fun. But also members of Congress joining us for that. Members of Congress joining with a letter from the Women's Democratic Caucus with Angela Merkel trying to get a meeting to say, why are you obstructing the waiver? And really trying to push from the congressional side what we can do. The administration, we have a mixed bag of people who support the waiver and people who don't. The Secretary of Commerce is no friend of ours and thinks that the waiver is too big of a giveaway to everyone. And everyone keeps telling these kind of big, I would say they're lies at this point, that we're just going to authorize this technology and this waiver forever, and we're going to destroy all intellectual property rights, and nobody's ever going to invest in R&D, which has been empirically denied. Like, we pursued a very similar strategy back to get generic drugs available for HIV back in the early 2000s. So we know that this happens, and that while pharma will keep farming, which means they will continue to make drugs that will make them money, and they're just not going to stop doing this. This is an unprecedented time, and you need to take things that are beyond a single company's ability to do so. The congressional allies are still keen to be supportive, but a lot of this is in the hands of our administration. So Ambassador Tai is supportive. Her team in Geneva, on the other hand, who is mainly a bunch of career folks, and they have particular views on patent rights and how patents should flow within the WTO. And they have been fairly silent on the question of the waiver in negotiation meetings. And we have not heard full-throated endorsements when this has come up. We've gone through both June and July, where the TRIPS Council has met and has come away with statements of no agreement on text going forward. We have changed our tactics. We're done asking for text-based negotiations. We're just asking for, you need to just put on the waiver. And we need to, the WTO likes to function by having a big vote for everything. Instead of having a vote for everything, they like to have consensus. We're saying we should vote because yes, like let's break the consensus idea and vote, because it seems hysterical that a couple countries can block what overwhelming majority of the world wants. And those couple countries are countries that have been a problem, who have their own vaccines and have their own levels of access. Like you're shilling for pharma in a world where like no one asked you to do that and you're taken care of. You're just saying nobody else should be able to have the ability to protect their people and be able to create manufacturing from their own. And we know that these are challenges that we're seeing now. We're having more pressure on NIH, trying to do more tech transfer and setting up the tech transfer hub the WTO is launching. We know tech transfer is possible despite the lies that some of the pharma companies will tell you, because Moderna just did tech transfer in Canada so that they can increase their own manufacturing capacity. And most of Moderna's manufacturing capacity was actually set up through the United States government, because when you're a small startup and you have a breakthrough vaccine, you don't really have a platform to create that vaccine. So Operation Warp Speed came in and said, let us build these things for you. So there are a lot of places and contexts where we can be doing a lot more. The question is, how far will the administration willing to take it? We know they keep dodging the global question, frankly. Anytime there's this issue in the United States, we retreat inward. So if you notice, the president gave a nice speech on Thursday about all the stuff we're doing for the US and then said, we'll get to the global stuff later this month. What he fails to mention later this month is the United Nations General Assembly and potentially Biden's own COVID summit that they've been secretly planning, yet not so secret planning. So all that is to say, lots of things happening, lots of opportunities, but also lots of sites of frustration. It is getting harder and harder to realize why we are continuing to go down this path that's not working. For instance, we saw Delta surging. We saw the supplies. We saw that we could have started acting. We haven't. We know that there's not enough vaccine supply. Why? Because at best, the United States has said we are going to donate 700 million doses. Now that's only 300 million people because they're mostly 2 shots. And at this point, we've only done 150 of those. So clearly we're not living up to even the donation numbers we're saying. We can't, the problem is beyond our capability to solve as one country. Oh, actually, if we really want to as one country, we could solve it, because we, as you've probably seen, that Congress has almost no limit on spending on the pandemic. Like trillions of dollars have magically appeared to do things that were never done before. But the question is, can we just let other countries go forward and make their vaccine? We can do tech transfer. We can support this. It wouldn't take that much. We know this because we've been helping Moderna set up their stuff for a while now. We know that it's possible because we're funding the Aspen Institute to do just that in South Africa. We know that there are sites that they can do it because there is literally a list of places that are certified by the FDA that are labs and places that it's possible to make this in. And then it's easier actually to make the mRNA technology than it is to make the huge bioreactors you need to do for, say, Johnson & Johnson's platform, where you need something about the size of a football field. And it just continues to be frustrating. But also, I will say, as you know, we talk a lot, I don't know, go to the questions right after I finish this last one. As soon as, one of the things I also want people to keep in mind, the waiver is not just about vaccines. So like monoclonal antibodies that you can get anywhere in the United States now for free as Americans, those aren't readily available. Now, those are hard to do for other countries because it takes forever to grow antibodies, but we're having new treatment options that are also coming up that would be once-a-day pills to be used as a quick prophylaxis before you got hospitalized that could potentially save you, that should be coming out this fall. You wouldn't have access to those. We know even in a world where vaccines are super accessible, as we've seen in our own country, rollout can be slow because of a number of factors. And so these technologies will also be critical and important. So all that is to say, lots of opportunity, lots of places we can go. It's a matter of finding what are the right sites, what are the right pressure points, and people just caring that like it doesn't have to be this way and we can make a difference.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. We are getting questions in the chat, which we will address at the end in the Q&A section. Just a reminder again, folks can put questions there for us to review at the end. And I heard that the live stream is up. So if you are viewing this through Facebook, you can put questions in the chat. We have folks monitoring that. We'll be happy to take your questions at the end. We're going to turn now to a number of folks with some firsthand knowledge of what Global South countries are facing. I want to introduce one of our local Washington advocates and a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, Golraz Azar. Go ahead, Golraz.
Hi, good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm no longer with the IHME. I used to be. That was my previous job. So yeah, I actually never imagined, speaking about this in this, moment of grief. It's a strange. I'm in a strange position as a researcher. I'm not comfortable making public speeches. As for my background, I'm a public health physician. I have a PhD in public policy. I have fieldwork experience in developing countries in India, in northern part in the state of Uttar Pradesh, the largest and most populous state of the country. Yeah, and till a few months ago, I was, as I said, was with IHME. But yet here we are, and I'm compelled to speak up because of the magnitude of the losses we all face, irreparable losses of losing people close to us, forever. And because of my unique position of a developing country public health researcher with personal experience of, losing family members in this. This year, the months of May, June, April were very, very hard for me. COVID was particularly bad in my state of UP. My entire family, immediate and extended, many of my friends, neighbors, and acquaintances were down with COVID symptoms. The health facilities there are bad. They're really bad and overburdened that few were able to get any, formal help, testing or treatment. I would stay up all night here, consoling my sick, symptomatic parents, my in-laws, my brother, his family, and anyone who reached out for any medical advice. And there were many of them. The news from home was devastating. Rivers were full of floating corpses, drone footage of mass funerals, streets were lined with dead bodies. Desperate people were trying to arrange oxygen and medicines on social media. While the image conscious government seemed to be doing what it does best, was to image and narrative management. I mean, there was rampant undercounting of deaths, clamping down with draconian measures against its own people who were trying to make sure that their loved ones do not die. It was absolute insanity. End of this, official numbers are close to 500,000 deaths, and unofficial estimates range from 10 to 30 times of those numbers. It had become really personal by the end of the month. I had lost 2 of my uncles, my father's sisters' husbands, leaving behind many of my orphaned cousins. 100 professors of my university had died, including 3 ex-deans of my med school. So many, but there was a face behind each number. A medical school junior just this January who had, placed stents in my father's heart, saving him from a heart attack, had died. Every phone call, every text message would, fill me up with dread. That is to say, without a large-scale vaccine rollout, this state of affairs will continue there. As things become normal here, the developing world, we will see wave after wave of viral mutations. I'll keep losing my, colleagues, family, and friends back home. We have examples of successful global partnerships from polio and smallpox vaccination campaigns. So why can't we have this for COVID? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Golraz. Every time I hear, I've gotten to hear you speak at a couple of events now, and every time I hear you speak, I'm just reminded of the urgency of the work that we're doing right now in regard to global vaccine access. Thanks so much. We are going to turn to Dr. Olivo Iglesias. He is the medical director at Verificovid, and he's joining us this morning from Mexico. Go ahead, Dr. Iglesias.
Hey, everyone. Good morning and good evening and good night to the other side of the world. I would like to speak a bit about my ground experience on the so-called first line of contents against COVID in Mexico. I'm a general practitioner, so I'm not in the first line in the emergency room. I'm not treating critic patients or complicated patients. But as I say, I'm in the real first line. I'm on the streets. I'm with the first contact level of treatment in Mexico's first response health system, right? And since the pandemic started, there were lots of evidences of Mexico's health system debilities or weakness. One of those is the lack of public investment in research and development of vaccines, as an example. So Mexico is a country like many others in the world who that is on this, I don't know how to traduce it, vías de desarrollo, like emerging economies. So it has lots of manufacturing capacity, but there's no public investment in the research to produce our own technologies. So this waivers, this TRIPS waiver initiative is something that we could really use to increase the efficiency in our production of health care requirements or vaccines. The US government has donated lots of vaccine doses for Mexico's border states. And we, the Mexican government, has also donated many few, but we have donated vaccine doses to Central America and Caribbean countries. So if the TRIPS waiver is, the process continues in the way it has been doing for this last time, we could have the opportunity to really increase access to vaccines to really emerging economic countries in South America. Right here in Mexico, the effort that the government has done to guarantee the access to vaccines for the Mexican population, I consider that has been a really great effort. As for today, we have acquired more than 200 million doses of vaccine, of COVID vaccines that ensure at least half of the adult population to be vaccinated as part of the ending of this year. But right now there's a very big public health issue regarding the lack of access for vaccine vaccine doses for the children and the younger community representatives of Mexico. Schools have just reopened in Mexico, and there's a big concern in many public sectors for the access of vaccines to protect or to have this kind of protection for our childhood. One of the answers Mexican government has given is that this tragedy, the national vaccine strategy in Mexico, was done last year, right about October of 2020. And in that time, there were no studies that ensured efficacy and safety on COVID vaccination of the younger Mexicans and the younger people everywhere in the world. As of today, some studies have concluded the safety and the efficacy of vaccinating childhood around the world. And there are no doses acquired in Mexico destinated for the vaccination of young people. So there's that big issue. Many people are deciding not to go to school, not to send their children to school until they are fully vaccinated. Mexico's vaccination campaign does not comprehend children vaccination as far as now. And that is something that has a lot to do with the doses we have acquired and the destination those doses have been predestinated. So there has been also a lot of issues in Mexico with the type of vaccines that people are receiving. Right now we have 6 authorized vaccines in Mexico, including Pfizer's, Moderna's, including Johnson & Johnson, including the Russian Sputnik 5, including CanSino, Sinopharm, and Sinovac. So there's 7 vaccines being applied right now in Mexico, of which only 3 are considered by many population safe. And those are the 3 vaccines that come from the US, that are Moderna's, Pfizer's, and Johnson & Johnson. Many people are refusing to being vaccinated, at least or on list that their dose is one of Pfizer's, for example. So many people are deciding not to get vaccinated because they are not receiving one of the World Health Organization recognized or authorized vaccines. And that is something that really hits me in my heart, because we're in a situation that requires being vaccinated and guaranteeing and fighting for to get as many as people vaccinated in the shorter time possible. And this kind of political and economical situations don't let that kind of situations go against the public health propósito, no? the purpose of public health. It's really worrying the mutation rate we have seen on this virus in the last year, since the emerging of the Delta variant this year and the domination of the Delta variant on the world's pandemic activity. Lots of questions have been asked about vaccines. Are they still being effective against this variant and the ones that will come? Because I don't think, and I hope you don't assume that Delta is the last concerned variant we are going to face in this pandemic. And I think the virus is mutating and adapting to our response as a global collective much more quicker than we are according to respond to that virus variations. So I think that it is very necessary to push on US governments and other governments to accede to put the waiver on the TRIPS, so other countries, other emerging economies, other places in the world that can produce at least some technologies have this this chain break, and we can support the global collective to accelerate access and to guarantee access for doses to everyone. Me, in my personal experience, I was not vaccinated with Pfizer's dose. That was the one government said it was destined to vaccinate healthcare personnel. I did not receive my vaccine dose in in the first line of vaccination in December 2020, January 2021. I was vaccinated with a line of professors 3 or 4 months later, and I received the Cancino shot.
Dr. Iglesias, I just want to note that we're getting close to time.
Okay,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
So I received this Cancino shot that is very bullied. Many people consider it to be an unsafe vaccine. Many countries do not recognize it as one of the vaccines to guarantee my access. For example, if I want to go to the European Union, I can't go because my shot is not recognized by the European Union as an effective vaccine against COVID. So there are many reasons for which we need to free the intellectual property on healthcare basic and fundamental issues in the world we're living right now. I think that's everything I like to say.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Olivo Iglesias. We're really grateful to you for joining us. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Christian Teo. He's joining us from Mexico. He is a documentary filmmaker and a student and civil rights activist in Mexico. Thanks for joining us, Christian. Go ahead.
Thank you, Hillary. I appraise the invitation to the panel to discuss the importance to the debate on the intellectual property rights and the pharmaceutical companies in vaccines and the restrictions in their production in Mexico and in Latin America in general. And it is not a new issue that nor was to be expected today in Mexico, like the countries in the global south, in the case of the friends of India, for example, will experience a health crisis much more exacerbated than the rest of the northern states, Europe and United States in this case. Today, the conditions or infections, the deaths, the economic crisis, the lack of the medical service, and the migratory catastrophe respond to a fundamental structural problem with the capitalist system. Who produce, who vaccinates for whom, and how are they administered fairly for all nations of the world? That is the main point that the problem, and therefore I will address the situation in a detailed way. The antecedents of the health crisis today in Mexico are located in the continuous measurement of the General Directorate of Epidemiology of the federal government. In recent months, the global death toll has reached the 3.5 million confirmed cases of contagious. This with the highest concentration in the center of the city and in the Republic, in the such place, the case of Ciudad de Mexico, el Estado de Mexico, in the north of the country, in the states like Nuevo León, Jalisco, and Guanajuato. Adding to this register, it is estimated that 266,000 people have died from pulmonary obstruction, has developed those symptoms of the current virus. In Mexico, with a population of around the 128 millions of persons, and an average age to 29 years, it is evident that the range of contagions and deaths is directly affecting these populations of semi-adults and young workers who represent more than 40% of the workforce on the national level. People who are salaried people and entire families depend on them. The country has more than 50 of workers in the informal sector who have to go into the streets and be exposed to the virus without social security to protect them, to be paid for their employers. We are talking about the numbers of the deaths and infections that represent almost 100% of the salary sector in Mexico, of workers and not a businessman or a capitalist who can pay and trade their contagion in a private hospital of the thousand that exist in the Republic, or travel abroad on vacation to get a dose. This is a conditional inequality in Mexico. In this fact, that who has paid for the broken dishes of the pandemic has not been the businessmen or the capitalist sector, but the thousands of Mexican workers who continue to be infected in a public transport, in a workplaces, in the street, go out only to pay for their food and places where they sleep with your wife and children. In a sense, we decide in the freedom of the market, it's like a tragic joke. If it's more feasible to choose to die from contagion or die for hunger. The vaccination campaign for this part, even the midst of the emergency, has followed the course something delayed. In certain aspects, since the end of last year, eschatological vaccinations has begun among the most affected population, in this case, who mentioned the Professor Oliver, following in priority to the case of adult older than 60 and 90 years, following in second priority by the people with 40, 59, 30, 40, and finally 18 to 29 years. And this is a period of 9 months that has some distribution problems and available reserves. Mexico has already paid 15 million pesos of the acquisition of these pharmacos or vaccines, but the current commitment is close to 50 million of the agreement with the pharmaceutical companies to supply the COVID-19 vaccines to Mexico. In May of this year, AstraZeneca is the company that locked the most distribution of vaccines in Mexico. Of the 77.4 million that had been agreed, there was not available at the time that, unfortunately, coincidence with the rise in infections. The delay occurred in other China's and North American pharmaceutical companies that only achieved the constant but marginal increase in case until July. The delayed amount of vaccine supply and the step shipping routes and prevent from us reaching to the goal of 170 million vaccines administered to the population, and a goal that the federal government has promoted. Until today, have chose 170 millions of only more 50 millions with arduous effort have managed to apply the dose. The answer is obvious. If Mexico needs to vaccinate more than 80% of his population, why instead shipments from a rate does it not develop a national and autonomous production that will be frees us from the problems? Hardly any efforts have been made in elaboration, say, national production with the Patria vaccines, which is it's a first phase of testing and could potentially extend its certification in period of 6 or 8 months. The issues is worrying, and the contagious and inherent actor from which no Latin American nation escapes, the voracious imperialists. In May, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, commented with our president, Andres Manuel, that he planned to provide 80 million doses for the good neighbor treatment. Until today, the shipment of supply seems to be regulated, with the last donation in August of 80 million vaccines between AstraZeneca and Moderna, thanks to the deal between the Vice President Kamala Harris and Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard. However, it is very coincidental that Biden's good neighborhood and charity are promoted alongside the persecution and cult-baiting suffered by Central American migrants south of the national border. If you have observed this situation in recent weeks, the federal government, through the institution of migration, has blown up caravans of illegal immigrants who intend to reach the United States and find a first wall in Mexico. It is clear that Andres Manuel government is under the pressure from the Washington be doing the dirty work, the immigrant police, shielding the borders so that the teeth of good neighborhood lines and the constant charity delivery of vaccine is not damaged by immigrants' problem, of which the United States is correctly to blame. Friends, it is time today to rethink the crisis and the solution in Mexico, in Latin America, and in the rest of the world. As Che Guevara said one time, nosotros no podemos confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así nada. We don't can trust in the imperialists and in the practice to the United States and the administrations of vaccines. It's a vital importance that the government of Andres Manuel fight with these pressures and promote the national production of vaccines, the complete and effective elimination of restrictive pharmaceutical patents and equitable distribution with the subject countries that exploited by the central powers in imperialist system. And friends, the intellectual property rules and the restrictions to save more lives today are only as simple that capitalists and imperialists don't to see life as a human priority, but their savage arrangement. We will fight for these extensions. Hasta la victoria siempre. Gracias. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. Our last speaker before we take a few questions will be Pauline Machina. She is the representative for Africa with the American Friends Service Committee. Welcome, Pauline. Did we lose her? Pauline, we can't hear you.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Hillary, and to every speaker who has spoken so brilliantly. That's the challenge of being the last speaker, because, most of what you would say had already been said. But I'm going to be speaking from an African perspective. And I also want to congratulate you for being here on a Saturday morning. And I have to charge my computer, which is crazy. But want to, first of all, say thanks for being here on a Saturday morning or afternoon. I know you are here because you're trying to figure out how to get vaccines to our brothers and sisters globally, to stop the unnecessary deaths and suffering that are happening because of COVID-19. And so that's why this webinar is happening. And I just want to know who is ready to make that happen. So go on your chat and say you're ready, if you are, and what you're willing to do to make that happen. I've seen the petition, but there's more that we can do. So please do that. So Africa is a continent of over 1.2 billion people, and only less than 3% of that population has been vaccinated. Other continents, that comprise our low and middle income countries have also vaccinated less than 2% or less than 3% of their people. Why? Vaccines are available, companies are manufacturing it. Other countries such as Canada can vaccinate their people 10 times over. And now they are getting the transfer of technology before countries that have none of the vaccines can actually do it. Look at Israel and Palestine. Israel has, vaccinated over 60% of its population. On the other hand, Palestine, which is neighboring, has vaccinated less than 2% of their people. There is racism, there is xenophobia, there is, whatever you want to call it, I'll let you decide that. But recently, the Africa CDC director stated that 32 African countries are facing the acute third wave of COVID, and 4 to 5 are actually facing the 5th wave. And Delta is becoming predominantly, the variant that is killing and destroying African countries. The impact of the pandemic on the health, on the economy, and the whole livelihood of African people is humongous. It's even difficult to really put it into context into figures, because testing is very low. So we don't even know how many people have ever been infected with COVID, how many people are dying of COVID, how many people are suffering because of COVID, because the statistics are not available or data is not available. There are so many stories of pain and suffering that have increased tremendously. People telling of the loss of their loved ones, through infection, poverty, and mental issues. The impact is devastating for the whole continent. My close friend lost his mother, his uncle, his cousin, and his friend the same week, and stories like this are repeated every day. Recently, my sister called me and told me that she's shutting her shop of 22 years. It's a hairdressing shop that she has owned and raised her 2 children through that income. But COVID has forced her to shut it down. So now she's unemployed, has no source of income. And that's just one story. Majority of people right now in Africa are in dire, situation because of COVID. Some are, I've been getting calls and text messages of help. I can't pay rent. I can't buy medicine. I can't do this because of this situation. And yet, let's keep it into perspective. Donations from rich countries will not get us out of COVID. My colleagues have already said it. COVAX is failing. This is the outfit that was, created to help these and other low and middle income countries to come out of it. It's not only funding, which is a challenge, but it's also accessibility of these vaccines, because the rich countries continue to hoard them. Yet we hear of boosters in these rich countries, and we know from a scientific perspective that boosters at the moment are not urgent for patients who are not immune compromised. So whatever they are doing is just greed. And also pharmaceutical companies love this because this will keep the whole rich nations in perpetual need of vaccines. And that's how they get rich. If they solve the issue of COVID by vaccinating everybody and the the virus stops mutating, then they won't need boosters anymore. And who will make money out of that? So they are not going to be helping us to end COVID. But we have to ask ourselves, how do you decide to condemn billions of people to death while you have the resources that can save them? Profits, protecting profit is not going to help not only, the rest of the world, but for Americans, for Europeans that are holding these vaccines, because the mutation will finally undermine the vaccines that have already been given here. As activists, let's be clear again that pharmaceutical companies are not trying to end COVID. They're trying to make money out of COVID. And if that's the case, then we have to have even stronger strategy of addressing this issue. The countries objecting to TRIPS waiver need to hear that they are killing people slowly and quickly or faster, because of the spread of Delta. It is apartheid, it is genocide, it's Holocaust, it's neo-colonialization, it's hoarding vaccines, call it what you may want, but they need to know from us that they are against humanity, and their claim of protecting human rights is failing because definitely they are not protecting the human rights of everybody. As they hoard vaccines and refuse to approve the TRIPS waiver, the virus continues to mutate. They need to share vaccines to save themselves and all of us. Until the global community is vaccinated, the danger of new mutation looms large. Are you willing to be bold with us? Are you willing to challenge these nations? If you are, then we must get everybody vaccinated who needs to be vaccinated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline. When Will and I were deciding speaker order, we knew that you would help us get people riled up right at the end. Thank you so much. Before we transition to the breakout portion of our webinar today, I did get a couple of questions. One that is specifically for Matthew, and then one that we're going to kind of open up to all the speakers. Matthew, folks are wondering what the best pressure point is, if there are folks in Congress that are the right people to tap on tech transfer stuff, or if all of that is the Biden administration.
No, so Patty Murray's office is a great people to lean on right now, especially because of reconciliation happening. And a lot of things will be going through the Health Committee. And yes, she's going to be doing a bunch of stuff on healthcare, but she herself asked for this pot of money that is going to be pandemic preparedness that could have some abilities to do some tech transfer stuff and manufacturing stuff in there. Also, she avoided the question of the TRIPS waiver, as did a number of senators. The only big West Coast senator that has really led the charge in a forceful way was Jeff Merkley. So kudos to anyone on the phone from Oregon. Jeff Merkley's doing great. All the other senators, you got some work to do. You're good on some other stuff, but we could use you being more full-throat endorsing of what needs to happen. Committee-wise, it's really the Help Committee and the ENC Committee, Energy and Commerce. And then you can pretty much, any of your representatives can make arguments to the trade office who handles all of this. And we're sending out a letter to remind all the endorsers this week about where things are at and why we need things. But it's really important for people to hear from constituents, mainly because they hear from those folks who live in the Beltway and work in the Beltway all the time. But they need to know that it's something that their constituents care about to make inroads on, and they need to be working on. And especially because it's so easy for so many people to let it get lost in the narrative about like where we're at with COVID, especially globally. Like, not to make you worried, but as we're talking about Delta right now, we're actually up to Mu in terms of variants of concern. So things that are looking like they could be a problem, but aren't a significant problem yet. So the virus is continuing to mutate. It's just a matter of, will any of these mutations be enough to be a problem? So really just making sure that Patty Murray, she's a very powerful person, hears some people from Washington and that they care about this, but also up and down the West Coast, that your senators know that this is an important issue for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I had one question that I want to open up to all the speakers. What are developing countries doing right now to the ones that are getting vaccines? Like, how are they getting them? Is it like COVAX related? Are they left to like negotiate with drug companies? Like, how is it happening?
Well, it's a bit of everything, right? We say in Spanish, no se ponen todos los huevos en la misma canasta. It's something like we do not put the eggs in only one basket. So, for example, Mexico has received about 7 million doses of vaccine through the COVAX initiative. And all the other has been in a part with the US government, for example. In another basket, we're trading directly with the pharmaceuticals, with AstraZeneca, for example. Mexico is producing or contributing in the production of AstraZeneca's vaccine. We only envasamos, we only pour it in these little frascos, in the vials. So we keep our share of AstraZeneca's vaccines and like that. So it depends on every country. There are lots of countries that depend on the COVAX initiative, and as we have all seen, the COVAX initiative has not been what we thought it could be. And I think that TRIPS waiver could help enhance the reach of the COVAX initiative.
I would just also add, in strewed geopolitics being played in vaccine diplomacy, both Russia and China are selling for fairly cheap cost their vaccines. They're surprisingly, Sputnik is not a bad vaccine. The Russians are actually very good vaccinologists. They just, nobody talks about it. And the Chinese one, Sino, I always get them mixed up. Sinovac, I believe, is the one that has very bad protection against the Delta variant. The entire Kingdom of Bahrain immunized themselves with it, as with the Seychelles, and then all got reinfected by Delta, or saw breakthrough infections. So it's not the best. We also think China will have an mRNA vaccine in the next 6 months potentially, but it's a hodgepodge out there. I would say, as Pauline said earlier, COVAX, it's there. It's supposed to be helping. There are all kinds of issues with it and who's getting those vaccines from it. Like the UK went back and raided the COVAX supply. Australia bought itself to the front of the COVAX line. It's not working. And there are a lot of articles about it not working well. And as you've heard from my colleagues on the phone, you can see what that not working well effect has resulted.
It's not only COVAX, I think, Matthew, but also these companies themselves are doing things that are really, unjust, like Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca manufacturing vaccines in South Africa, and actually not manufacturing, but packaging them in South Africa and then shipping them to Europe, and leaving people in South Africa itself to die while they sell the vaccines in Europe, because they are going after the highest profit. That's why we are hearing, vaccine by billionaires. They've made so much money that, and they will continue if this trend continues. So that's why we have to say that whatever they are doing is wrong. It's because of greed, but also it's not that these countries don't have the capacity to produce vaccines. They do, but it is because of all this greed and because of all this political, I don't know what to call it. It's not even playing politics with people's lives. That's why we see what is happening. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. I want to note for the speakers that there's a question in the chat about what orgs are working on this on the ground. And I don't think it's necessary for us to list off a whole bunch of them right here, but I would love to get, some of those organizations that we could coordinate with, or even do like international solidarity stuff as we have been doing for the past several months. That is all the time we have for Q&A, because I want to be sure that we have an opportunity to get into our breakout rooms in the second half and start planning actions and all of that. I, like everyone, I think I'm so sick of Zoom, and I wish I could unmute everyone so that the speakers would know how much we appreciate their time. I would love for folks to put a thank you in the chat to all of our speakers for joining us this morning and for making time out of their schedules. Speakers, you are welcome to join us in the breakouts if you want. There is no obligation for any of you to do that. There's going to be a link dropped in the chat that's going to prompt you to go to a different Zoom room where we can put people in breakout rooms so that we can start just planning our actions in our different states. Go ahead. So there's that link. Thank you all speakers so much. We really appreciate you being here. For folks who are still attending, go ahead and click on that link that Global Exchange keeps dropping in the chat. We're going to switch over to breakout rooms so that we can start planning state-specific actions in the coming months to talk through strategy and what different pressure points we have in each of our states. Speakers, this room is going to stay open, so you're never going to get kicked out, just so you know. You're welcome to join us in breakouts. You're welcome to hop off. I really, really appreciate each of you being here, and I will send thank you notes. So you'll hear from me one more time. And I would love to get, like I said, orgs that are working on this on the ground in places. Karina, if you could drop that one more time. I see that people are not. Yep, there we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would say, Hillary, for people, the quick place is look at the list of orgs co-sponsoring the People's Vaccine Alliance.
Oh, I didn't even think
that
about
has a
that.
huge number of folks by country. It's a quick and dirty way of doing it, but there's also more specifics as one goes. So
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
thank you all so much for having me. I'm gonna hop to go run some errands.
Okay,
Same,
great.
same. Thank you.
For being here.
And thank you, Hillary, for having me. Thank you, really.
Yeah, thank you so much, Coraz.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian, Dr. Olivo.
Thank you, Hillary. Oh, so I enter in the link, right?
Yeah, if you want to join one of the breakouts, you definitely can, but it's all West Coast stuff.